I followed every rule, almost. Now, as I write this, I can only hope someone will find these words before it's too late. The job offer came at just the right time, or maybe the wrong one. After months of joblessness and the suffocating pressure of city life, I needed an escape. The promise of solitude in a remote cabin high in the Alps felt like salvation. Caretaker was the title, though the job description was vague. The owner simply needed someone to maintain the property and respect its traditions. The pay wasn't spectacular, but the opportunity to disappear for a while was worth far more than any paycheck. When I arrived, the air was crisp and thin, carrying a stillness that bordered on unsettling. Snow blanketed everything in sight, absorbing sound and leaving the world eerily quiet. The cabin stood alone against a backdrop of jagged peaks, its dark wood blending into the forest, as if it were part of the mountain itself. It was older than I expected, with windows that gleamed faintly as if they were watching me back. The man who greeted me, Mr. Weiss, was as strange as the cabin. Dressed in a wool coat that seemed as ancient as the trees surrounding us, his sharp features and piercing blue eyes gave me the impression he could see through me. He didn't smile. Instead, he handed me a thick envelope sealed with wax. "Read this immediately," he said, his voice as cold as the wind. "These are the rules. They are not suggestions. Follow them exactly or—" He hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Or you'll regret it." I should have asked him to elaborate, but something in his tone, and the way his gaze flicked to the woods behind me, stopped me. I nodded, clutching the envelope tightly as he turned and walked away without another word. Inside, the cabin was warm but unsettlingly quiet. A fire roared in the stone hearth, but I couldn't remember anyone lighting it. The furniture was simple and functional, the kind you'd expect in a place like this. Yet every creak of the wooden floor felt amplified, as though the cabin itself was alive. I sat by the fireplace and opened the envelope, the crack of the wax seal echoing unnaturally. 7 rules were written in neat, looping handwriting. Number 1, do not open the basement door. Number 2, turn off all lights at midnight. Number 3, speak only when spoken to. Number 4, leave an offering by the tree at dusk. Number 5, do not use the cabin's phone. Number 6, ignore the mirror in the bathroom. Number 7, do not leave before dawn. At first, I chuckled nervously. It had to be some kind of elaborate joke. Who leaves rules like these for a caretaker? But as I read them again, my unease grew. The words seemed to pulse on the page, as though daring me to disobey. The wind howled outside, and for the first time, I noticed the shadows in the corners of the room. They seemed to shift and stretch as the fire flickered, almost as if they were listening. I should have walked away then. I should have turned back. But I didn't, and that's where it all began. The cabin was nestled in a shallow valley, surrounded by towering pines that stretched toward the sky like skeletal fingers. A thin layer of frost clung to every surface, even in the middle of the day, giving the place a stark, otherworldly beauty. The snow-draped landscape seemed untouched by time, yet the silence wasn't the serene kind you'd find in a postcard. It was oppressive, heavy, like a held breath waiting to exhale. The cabin itself looked like it had grown out of the mountain. Dark timber, weathered by years of brutal winters, made up the walls. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, covered in patches of moss and snow. Up close, I noticed peculiar details. Claw marks gouged into the doorframe and faint streaks of what I told myself was rust on the shutters. A sturdy iron lock secured the basement door, its surface too polished for something supposedly old. The windows were strange. They caught the light even when the sun barely broke through the dense clouds, glinting like eyes. I could have sworn they reflected not just my image, but something else, something behind me. Each time I turned, there was nothing but the trees and the shadows they cast. The inside of the cabin was somehow worse. The air smelled faintly of pine and something metallic. A large stone hearth dominated, its fire crackling in a way that sounded almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old books and knickknacks, faded photographs, chipped figurines, and what looked like bones carved into strange. I walked slowly through the space, noticing how the floorboards groaned under my weight, as if protesting my presence. The single bedroom was sparsely furnished, a bed, a nightstand, and a wardrobe that seemed too large for the room. The bathroom mirror caught my eye as I passed, its surface marred with faint smudges. One smudge resembled the outline of a hand. The kitchen had a single window overlooking the forest. I didn't like the view. The trees seemed too close, their branches curling toward the glass like they wanted in. The old rotary phone sat on the counter, its cord tangled and frayed. I went back to the fireplace and stared at the rules. They felt out of place here, like they belonged to a different world altogether. Still, Mr. Weiss's voice echoed in my mind. Follow them exactly, or you'll regret it. His demeanor had unnerved me. He hadn't lingered, as though he was afraid to spend more time here than necessary. Even when he handed me the envelope, his eyes never left the surrounding forest. It was as if he expected something, or someone, to emerge from the shadows. Outside, the wind picked up, whispering through the trees with an almost human cadence. For a moment, I thought I heard voices. A low hum, barely audible but persistent. I told myself it was just the wind. But the cabin didn't feel like just a cabin. It felt like a trap, and I had willingly walked into it. The first night in the cabin passed uneventfully, or at least, I convinced myself it did. Despite the rules sitting heavy in my mind, I slept surprisingly well, lulled by the crackling of the fire. Morning came too quickly, the gray light filtering through the windows doing little to lift the unease that had settled in my chest. It wasn't until midday that I heard it for the first time, a faint scratching noise coming from beneath the floorboards. At first I ignored it, assuming it was some kind of animal. The cabin, as rustic as it was, likely had mice or raccoons tucked away in the nooks and crannies. But as the sound grew louder, more deliberate, it became harder to dismiss. By evening it wasn't just scratching anymore. There was a distinct tapping, slow and rhythmic, as though someone, or something, was knocking from below. I froze in place, my hands tightening around the broom I had been using to sweep the kitchen. The sound came again, louder this time, and I swear I felt the vibration under my feet. I glanced toward the basement door. It stood at the far end of the main room, a thick iron lock glinting dully in the firelight. The door itself looked ancient, its wood warped and splintered with age. A faint chill seemed to radiate from it, as if the air on the other side was colder than the rest of the cabin. The first rule echoed in my mind. Do not open the basement door. I told myself there was no reason to open it. The lock was there for a reason, and the rules were clear. But the noises wouldn't stop. They grew stranger as the night stretched on, faint whispers just barely audible, mingling with the scratching and tapping. I strained to make out the words, but they dissolved into static-like murmurs whenever I tried to focus. It's probably just animals, I muttered to myself, my voice shaky. Maybe a raccoon got stuck, or the wind is playing tricks. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was down there, something that wasn't an animal. At one point, I moved closer to the door, each step reluctant. The air felt colder with every inch, a biting chill that seeped through my clothes and into my bones. When I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lock. A deep, unsettling instinct clawed at me to stop. As if on cue, the tapping stopped. Silence fell, so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I stepped back, my pulse racing. The quiet was worse than the noises had been. It was charged with something electric, something alive. Turning away, I forced myself to return to the fireplace. I kept my back to the door, the flames casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the room. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't dare. Somewhere below, the scratching started again. And this time, it sounded closer. By the second night, the cabin's rules felt less like guidelines and more like a lifeline. Rule 1 had taught me that much. I avoided the basement door like it was cursed, but it didn't matter. The scratching continued, its rhythm relentless, and my nerves were fraying. When I reread the list of rules before bed, my eyes lingered on the second. Turn off all lights at midnight. The phrasing was oddly specific. At midnight. Not before, not after. The thought of fumbling for switches at the stroke of 12 filled me with dread. What would happen if I didn't? The old clock on the mantel ticked loudly, counting down to the moment I would have to comply. Its presence, which had been quaint during the day, now felt suffocating. Time was no longer a passive thing. It had teeth. At 11:45, I started preparing. I turned off the overhead lights in the main room, leaving only the fire burning. It cast flickering shadows across the walls, the kind that played tricks on the mind. The lamp in the bedroom was next, its soft glow replaced by darkness. That left the kitchen, where a single bulb hung from a frayed cord in the ceiling. I stood beneath it, staring at the switch. The clock ticked closer to midnight, and an inexplicable weight settled on me. I felt watched, though the cabin was empty. At least I thought it was. The phone on the counter gave a single, sharp ring. I jumped, nearly knocking over a stack of dishes. It didn't ring again, but the sound lingered in my ears like an accusation. I didn't answer. At 11:59, I extinguished the kitchen light. The cabin was plunged into a dim, eerie glow, illuminated only by the fire. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as if testing their strength. I sat by the hearth, hugging my knees, my eyes fixed on the clock. When the minute hand struck 12, I let out a shaky breath, relieved that I'd followed the rule. But the relief was short-lived. From outside, something moved. A shadow passed across the window, quick, deliberate. I froze. It couldn't have been an animal. The silhouette was too large. It moved again, closer this time, its form distorted by the frosted glass. The fire dimmed suddenly, its glow shrinking to embers. I was plunged into near-total darkness. My breath hitched as I saw another shadow flicker, this one inside the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't blink. My heart thundered as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. The figure stood near the kitchen, tall and still, its outline barely visible. Seconds stretched into eternity before it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The fire roared back to life, and I was alone again. Or so it seemed. I stayed up all night, my back against the wall, the rules running through my mind on an endless loop. I didn't know what had come into the cabin at midnight, but I knew it had obeyed the darkness, and so would I. By the third day, I was teetering on the edge of paranoia. The cabin's isolation, which had seemed so inviting in the job description, now felt suffocating. Every sound, every shadow seemed charged with malice. Even the rules, which I clung to for survival, felt like a noose tightening around my neck. It was late afternoon when I first noticed him. Through the frost-glazed window, I spotted a figure standing at the edge of the forest. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out his face, but his presence was unmistakable. A silhouette too still, too deliberate, like a shadow that didn't belong. I tried to ignore it, but an hour later he was closer, standing near the twisted tree where I had left an offering the previous night. He didn't move. His face was still obscured, but I felt his eyes on me, unblinking and invasive. The wind picked up, carrying faint whispers. At first, I thought it was the trees. Then I realized the whispers weren't random. They were forming words. My name. Stay calm, I whispered to myself, gripping the rules list like a talisman. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the knock came. 3 sharp raps on the cabin door, precise and deliberate. My stomach lurched. The figure outside had disappeared from the window moments before, and now he was here. I moved to the door, my footsteps hesitant, the rules screaming in my head. Speak only when spoken to. I steadied myself, took a breath, and opened the door a crack. The man on the other side was tall and gaunt, with a smile stretched too wide across his face. His skin was pale, almost translucent in the fading light. He wore a dark coat that looked like it belonged in another century, and his eyes, black and endless, locked onto mine. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth but unnatural, like it didn't belong to him. I nodded but said nothing. My throat tightened as the rule echoed in my mind. He tilted his head, his smile growing impossibly wider, revealing teeth too sharp, too perfect. "May I come in?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. I shook my head, gripping the edge of the door so tightly my knuckles turned white. His smile faltered just for a moment. "You've read the rules," he said, his tone sharper now. He leaned closer, his face inches from mine. "Haven't you?" I nodded again, swallowing hard. The man straightened, his smile returning. "Good. You'll need them." Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest as if the shadows had swallowed him whole. I slammed the door and locked it, my hands trembling. I had obeyed the rule. I hadn't spoken, but his final words echoed in my mind, a warning I couldn't shake. You'll need them. I didn't sleep that night, and when the whispers returned, they sounded like him. By the time dusk approached, the rules had begun to feel less like a set of strange guidelines and more like a matter of life and death. The figure from the previous night haunted my thoughts, his too wide smile and chilling words playing on a loop in my mind. Still, the fourth rule was clear, and I had no intention of testing its consequences. Leave offerings by the tree at dusk. The tree wasn't hard to find. It loomed just behind the cabin, gnarled and ancient, its branches twisting unnaturally toward the sky like skeletal arms reaching for salvation. Its bark was blackened, charred as though struck by lightning, and yet it pulsed with a strange energy, as if alive. The snow beneath it was stained dark, the earth beneath barren and lifeless despite the surrounding forest's lushness. I carried the offering in a small wicker basket, a piece of bread, a candle, and a vial of honey. Items Weiss had left in the kitchen with no explanation. As I approached the tree, a chill ran down my spine, colder than the alpine air. The tree seemed to sense my presence. Placing the basket at its base, I backed away slowly, resisting the urge to turn my back on it. The air around the tree felt heavier, thicker, as though something unseen was watching. I whispered a silent prayer, though to what, I didn't know, and hurried back inside. I sat by the window, staring out at the tree as the final rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. For a long time, nothing happened. The forest was silent, the cabin still. Then, just as the first stars began to speckle the night sky, the forest stirred. The wind rose, carrying a low, guttural sound that wasn't human yet wasn't entirely animal either. My eyes locked on the tree as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, impossibly thin, with elongated limbs that moved unnaturally. Its face was obscured by darkness, but the way it moved, deliberate and predatory, sent waves of terror through me. The creature knelt by the offering, its movements jerky and wrong, as if it didn't fully understand how to use its own body. It inspected the basket, tilting its head unnaturally, before extending a clawed hand to take the items. Then it paused. Its head snapped toward the cabin and I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Though I couldn't see its eyes, I felt them, piercing and cold, boring into me. Slowly it straightened, its long fingers clutching the basket, and slinked back into the forest without a sound. The weight in the air lifted, but the fear lingered. I stayed glued to the window for hours, waiting for the creature to return. It didn't. The next morning I found the basket at the base of the tree, empty but pristine, as if it had been cleaned and placed back deliberately. I didn't forget the offering again. Not after that. I couldn't. The phone sat in the kitchen, silent and unassuming, an old rotary relic with a coiled cord frayed at the edges. By the third night, I had learned to avoid even looking at it. The fifth rule was clear. Do not use the cabin's phone. But that night the phone rang. It was past midnight, the fire burning low in the hearth. I had convinced myself I could relax after leaving the offering at the tree, but the sharp, shrill ring of the phone cut through the quiet like a knife. I froze, my heart pounding. For a moment, I thought about letting it ring, ignoring it altogether. But it didn't stop. The sound grew louder, more insistent, like it wasn't just a phone, but an alarm, a warning. I rose from my chair slowly, as if afraid the phone might sense my movements. Each step toward the kitchen felt heavier, the air thick with unseen tension. When I reached the phone, I hesitated, staring at it as it rang again. Then, against every instinct screaming at me to stop, I picked it up. Hello? My voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a voice crackled through the receiver, faint and distorted, like it was traveling from somewhere far away, or somewhere it shouldn't. Why did you answer? The voice whispered. Soft but filled with malice. A shiver ran down my spine. Who is this? I managed to ask, gripping the phone tightly. You shouldn't have answered, the voice repeated, a low, guttural laugh following the words. Now it knows. The line went dead, the sudden silence deafening. My hand trembled as I placed the receiver back on its cradle. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the phone, its presence now menacing in a way I couldn't describe. I tried to shake off the unease and return to the main room, but the fire had almost died completely, leaving the cabin in near darkness. As I knelt to add more wood, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. The phone cord. It was stretched taut, snaking across the floor like it had been pulled. Slowly, my eyes followed its length, leading to the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to move and breathe. The cord stopped abruptly, vanishing into the darkness. I didn't dare move closer. My pulse thundered in my ears as I backed away, clutching the rules list like it could protect me. Then the cord slackened, retracting slowly as if whatever had pulled it had let go. The phone in the kitchen was perfectly still, but I knew better. The rules weren't just arbitrary. They were barriers keeping things at bay. And I had broken one. That night I didn't sleep. The phone didn't ring again, but the whispers outside the window grew louder, more insistent. They knew my name now, and they weren't going to let me forget it. By the fourth night, I was unraveling. The rules weighed on me like chains, each one reminding me of how perilously close I was to something I couldn't understand, something waiting to punish a single misstep. But the sixth rule, that one felt different. Ignore the mirror in the bathroom. The bathroom mirror wasn't particularly large, but it was old, its edges tarnished and its surface marred with faint scratches and smudges. During the day, I had no trouble avoiding it, brushing my teeth and washing my face without so much as a glance. But at night, when the cabin's strange silence deepened, it felt alive. It started subtly, a flicker of movement when I wasn't looking, a glint of light that didn't match the room's dim glow. I told myself it was my imagination, a mind primed for fear by the other rules. But the mirror seemed to know I was avoiding it, and it didn't like being ignored. That night, the scratching in the walls had stopped entirely, replaced by something worse. From the bathroom came faint, rhythmic tapping, not like an animal or the wind. No, this was deliberate, insistent, like knuckles rapping against glass. I stayed in the main room as long as I could, clutching the list of rules, my eyes flicking to the bathroom door with every sound. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it became impossible to ignore. I didn't want to go in, but what if the rules meant I had to ignore the mirror, not the noise? What if ignoring the sound was breaking the rule in its own twisted way? Trembling, I crept toward the door, the floorboards groaning beneath me. I pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. The bathroom was dark, the single bulb above the mirror casting faint, uneven light. The mirror was ordinary, at first. Then I noticed my reflection wasn't quite right. It was subtle at first glance, a slight delay in its movements, a hesitation that wasn't mirrored in my actions. When I tilted my head, it followed, but a fraction too late. My chest tightened as I stepped back. The tapping stopped abruptly, and for a moment the room was unnervingly still. Then my reflection moved. Not me. My reflection. It leaned closer, pressing its hands against the glass, its eyes locking onto mine with a cold, desperate intensity. Its mouth opened, forming silent words, but I couldn't make them out. I slammed the door shut, my breaths ragged as I stumbled back into the main room. My hands shook as I gripped the rules list, reading the sixth rule over and over. Ignore the mirror in the bathroom. The tapping resumed, louder now, accompanied by muffled whispers. My reflection wanted something, but I wouldn't look again. I sat in front of the fire until dawn, covering my ears to block the sound. The next morning, the mirror was cracked, and in its fractured surface, my reflection was smiling. The final rule loomed over me, its weight far greater than the others. Do not leave before dawn. It was simple enough, but I couldn't shake the implications. What would happen if I left? What would stop me if I tried? On the fifth night, I was desperate. The whispers outside had grown louder, clearer, as if they were no longer content to linger beyond the cabin's walls. I swore I heard footsteps circling the perimeter, their pace slow and deliberate. The scratching beneath the floorboards had returned, accompanied by faint laughter. The walls themselves felt thinner, more fragile, as though the cabin was shrinking, unable to protect me. The fire burned low, the embers casting fleeting, sinister shapes onto the walls. I stared at the clock. Midnight had come and gone. Dawn felt impossibly far away. Every fiber of my being screamed for escape. I grabbed my coat and boots, stuffing the rules list into my pocket. My breath came fast and shallow as I stepped toward the door. "Just get to the car," I whispered to myself, as if saying it aloud would make it true. The vehicle was parked just down the snow-covered path. I could make it. The moment I opened the door, the cabin's warmth fled. The cold outside wasn't natural. It was punishing, a biting chill that seemed to crawl under my skin. The wind howled through the trees, but it wasn't the wind I feared. As I stepped outside, I felt them watching. Shadows moved among the trees, tall and thin, their elongated forms barely visible against the darkness. They didn't rush me. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to freeze me in place. I forced myself to move, each step toward the car a battle. The snow crunched beneath my boots, the sound deafening in the oppressive silence. I dared not look back at the cabin, afraid of what I might see. Then the whispers started. "You broke the rule," they hissed, overlapping voices that surrounded me from all sides. "You can't leave now." I broke into a run, my legs trembling as I stumbled through the snow. The car came into view, a glimmer of hope amidst the suffocating darkness. I reached it, fumbling for the keys with numb fingers. The engine sputtered to life, and for a brief moment relief flooded me. But the shadows were faster. They emerged from the tree line, dozens of them, their hollow eyes fixed on me. The car's headlights illuminated their impossible forms, elongated limbs, faces twisted into grotesque, unnatural expressions. The first one reached the car, its hand slamming against the window. Cracks spidered across the glass as more of them surrounded me, their whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. And then, everything stopped. The car died, the lights extinguished. The sun broke over the horizon, bathing the cabin in pale light. The shadows retreated, but I wasn't safe. Dawn had saved me, but only just. Something told me they'd be waiting if I tried again. Dawn brought no comfort. The pale light of morning stretched weakly across the snow, illuminating a cabin that felt more prison than refuge. I had barely survived the night, but the rules weighed heavier on me now. They weren't instructions, they were warnings, boundaries meant to keep something far worse at bay. I staggered back into the cabin, my limbs frozen and my mind a whirlwind of fear. The fire had gone out completely, leaving the air inside just as frigid as the outside. The shadows from the night before were gone, but their presence lingered in the deep silence as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. I sat by the cold hearth, staring at the list of rules crumpled in my hand. They weren't just arbitrary rituals or precautions. Each rule wasn't about maintaining order. They were bargains, acts of submission to whatever malevolent force controlled this place. And I had broken one. The phone hadn't rung again, but the memory of that voice, soft, malevolent, and knowing, haunted me. The mirror in the bathroom was shattered, its jagged surface catching the light like it was mocking me. I refused to go near it, afraid that whatever reflection I'd see wouldn't be mine anymore. The rules had shifted something in the cabin, or maybe in me. I felt watched constantly, not by any single presence but by the cabin itself. Every creak of the floorboards and groan of the wind felt deliberate, as if it was speaking to me in a language I couldn't understand. By late afternoon, I began to write this account. It felt like the only way to keep my sanity intact. My hands shook as I documented each rule, each moment of terror. If I didn't make it, maybe someone would find these words. Maybe they would know what to do, or know to stay far, far away. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, a low hum began to resonate through the cabin. It was faint at first, barely perceptible, but it grew louder as the shadows in the room deepened. I made one last attempt to escape. Grabbing my bag and the keys, I bolted for the car, determined to leave before the sun set. But the moment my hand touched the door, the hum became a deafening roar. The walls trembled, the shadows writhed, and the whispers started again. "You broke the rule," they hissed, louder than ever. "You can't leave." I fell back, my breath catching in my throat. Something moved in the darkness outside the window, something massive, its shape defying logic. I slammed the door shut and locked it, retreating to the farthest corner of the cabin. Now, as I write these final words, I can hear them. They're closer tonight, circling the cabin with purpose. The rules didn't just protect me. They chained me here. The cabin needs a caretaker. I can only hope you follow the rules better than I did. Because if you don't, you won't make it to dawn,